I was introduced to meditations. I was about 19 years old. This is right before I dropped out of college. I tore this book apart. It's what the economist Tyler Cowen would call a quake book. It shakes everything that I think that I know about the world. Now, admittedly, I'm 19 years old, so it's not a whole hell of a lot, but really it's a single passage in this book that has the most resonance for me, and I'll show that to you now. He's saying, our actions may be impeded, but there can be no impeding our intentions or dispositions because we can accommodate and adapt. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. And then he concludes with the maxim that I've tried to live my life by. He says, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And so this is the critical tenet of Stoicism. Essentially, in any and every situation, no matter how bad or seemingly undesirable it is, we have the opportunity to practice a virtue. And virtue is a bit loaded, so we'll replace that with excellence. Everything that happens to us is a chance to practice excellence. And this is, I think, best illustrated by a quote from Andy Grove, who's one of the CEOs of Intel. He's saying, bad companies are destroyed by crisis, good companies survive them, great companies are improved by them. The Stoics say over and over again, we don't control what happens to us, we control how we respond. Oftentimes, unfortunately, the way we respond to something makes it worse. We tell ourselves that something is unfair, we tell ourselves that we're screwed over, we tell ourselves that this is the worst thing that ever happened. And great people don't do this, right? When the United States was launching the Apollo program, what they actually looked for in the astronauts was not their ability to pilot, although they hired some of the greatest test pilots from the Air Force, but what they really looked for was their ability to regulate their emotions in stressful situations. And they trained this skill to its apex. So over and over again, the astronauts were exposed to stressful situations. They were gradually exposed over time to everything they would potentially face in space. So when an astronaut like John Glenn orbits the planet Earth for more than a day, his heart rate actually never goes over 100 beats per minute. Meanwhile, most of us, we get an angry phone call or an unpleasant email, we start to feel that pounding on our chest because we haven't practiced that. And it's so dangerous, especially for an astronaut, not to practice that because without that meticulous preparation, if something goes wrong, you're really screwed over. You can, as Chris Hadfield, who's a Canadian astronaut, said a few years ago, he's saying, look, it's worth remembering that there's no problem so bad that you can't make it worse also. And that's oftentimes what our perceptions do. We make a bad thing even worse, and then we complain that it's too hard to get over. And so I'm particularly inspired by people who don't do this. So as Epictetus says, who then is invincible? The one who cannot be upset by anything outside his reasoned choice. And John D. Rockefeller, right, as a young man, he starts in finance. A few years later, the Panic of 1857 strikes. And it's one of the worst economic crises in American history. It actually originates in Ohio, where he's based. But what Rockefeller does is he sees this as an opportunity to study the market, to see what people do in extreme situations, and to learn from it. And he ultimately calls this his apprenticeship. How blessed are those who struggle for a foundation or a beginning in life. And he's actually grateful that this happened. And in fact, he makes a significant part of his fortune in the next economic crises because he trained in that one. So the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1907, even as an old man in 1929, when the market goes south, he makes a fortune again because he'd had this apprenticeship in difficulty. And so that's just a slight tweak on how to look at a difficult thing, turns it into a benefit rather than an obligation that we have to go through. And as Seneca says, a good person dyes events with his own color and turns whatever happens to his own benefit.
Thanks for watching. Please click subscribe below for more content from us at Daily Stoic.